Berlin, September 30th, 1933. Spartacus Olsson reporting from the German capital. On the busy streets and the plentiful countryside of Germany, the summer of 1933 was a sun-baked Nazi dream, draped in swastika flags, where Germans grew hopeful of an economic wonder, while in Dachau near Munich, we saw the birth of a new kind of state terror, the Nazi concentration camp system. Tonight, we revisit both that dream and that nightmare. In the third quarter of 1933, the coordinated international attempts to overcome the global economic depression fell apart. Now it is each country to themselves. The US found itself on a roller coaster between boom and bust. Great Britain began a steady but slow recovery. France was in a deepening deflationary crisis, and Germany at least looked like it was in recovery. Although, as we shall see, that was in no small part based on an artificial economic construct created by the Weimar Republic and now under the wizardry of Reichsbank chief Hjalmar Schacht and Nazi manipulation of statistics. German dictator Adolf Hitler announced that the revolution was done, while Nazi terror was further institutionalized and formalized. In Rome, the Catholic Church signed a treaty with Hitler that critics are calling a capitulation to Nazi ideology, and the final stages of the elimination of German democracy concluded. On July 5th, the Catholic Center Party, the last significant democratic bulwark, dissolved itself, yielding to the regime's pressure. The one-party Nazi state was codified on July 14th with the law against the formation of new parties. Simultaneously, Hitler moved to curb the chaotic violence of his own followers to reassure the conservative elites and the army. On July 6th, he addressed the Reich governors, declaring that the revolution is not a permanent condition and must be guided into the secure bed of evolution. International legitimacy was bolstered on July 20th when the regime signed the concordat with the Vatican. This treaty provided Hitler with a significant diplomatic victory, neutralizing potential Catholic opposition by trading the Church's political withdrawal for guarantees of religious freedom. Since Hitler came to power, the Holy See has taken an accommodating stance to the Nazis. Sources in the Vatican indicate that the primary cause is the view that the common enemy of the two, Bolshevism, is to the Pope and his cardinals the greater of two evils. Moreover, as is well documented, the Church has a long history of anti-Jewish theology and implicit hostility to Judaism. So, to this reporter, it would seem natural that some clerics would sympathize with the Nazi ideology. That said, there is a meaningful number of German priests and Catholic activists who have individually spoken out against both the general terror and the persecution of Jewish Germans, and so have themselves drawn both ire and prosecution for, quote, immoral acts by the Nazis. With the Concordat, the Nazis have committed to tolerate the Catholic Church if they bring the clergy in line and keep them out of political activism. It's a balancing act on a tightrope between moral clarity and self-preservation, which was summarized by Archbishop of Munich and Freising, Cardinal von Faulhaber, when he privately condemned the anti-Jewish boycott day, but added that the Church must not cause to give the government a reason to turn the Jew baiting into Jesuit baiting. With that, and so many rapid successes under their belt, the Nazis organized a colossal spectacle of celebration and mass adoration of Nazism and Hitler from August 30th to September 3rd in Nuremberg during the Reich Party Rally of Victory. In a huge park in the city, now branded the Reichsparteitagsgelände, the Reich Party Rally Grounds, they put on a colossal display of indescribable jubilation and military precision. 100,000 uniformed men marched beneath a forest of flags, while Hitler, standing amidst the hysteria of the masses, consecrated their new standards by touching them with the blood flag of the failed 1923 putsch. While all of Germany was draped in a deepening ocean of red, black, and white swastika flags, the erosion of individual rights and systematization of terror continued. On July 14th, the law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring was passed, mandating forced sterilization for those deemed biologically inferior. At Dachau, outside Munich, the machinery of terror underwent a fundamental transformation. In late June, the leader of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, appointed Theodor Eicke as new commandant of Dachau concentration camp. Eicke, a, quote, roughneck and fanatical Nazi who had until recently been incarcerated in a psychiatric clinic, replaced the erratic Hilmar Weckele, whose arbitrary murders had drawn unwanted judicial scrutiny. Eicke is said to be revolutionizing the camp system. He has reorganized the SS guard troops, dismissed the police auxiliaries, and established a rigid, militarized system of terror. He's said to be drafting a disciplinary and punishment code meant to replace impulsive violence with codified brutality. Eicke is also apparently indoctrinating his guards to hate the enemies of the state, famously declaring that tolerance means weakness. Under Eicke, Dachau is said to become a model camp, sealed off from the outside world and the judiciary, where the SS serves as both judge and executioner. Himmler has privately indicated that Dachau is only the first of many such model camps. This was one of several steps of formalizing Nazi terror and control this quarter. With the Reichskulturkammergesetz of 22nd of September 1933, the Nazis established the Reich Chamber of Culture under Joseph Goebbels, organizing all cultural professions into public corporations under state control. By making membership mandatory for employment, the regime has now effectively enforced Gleichschaltung, systematically purging Jews and political opponents from all aspects of German cultural life, from the press to movies to publishing to music to the theater, by simply denying them the necessary work permits. It also ensures draconian control over cultural expression so that it is in line with Nazi propaganda. That propaganda continued to trumpet the economic miracle promised by Hitler, and the economy did show some significant signs of stabilization. However, this reporter has it from solid sources that some of this Nazi success is based on acts by previous governments, trickery and sleight of hand by Reichsbank President Hjalmar Schacht, and doctoring of statistics. Take, for instance, the law for the reduction of unemployment passed last quarter that began to take effect these last 3 months, when funding of public works, orders to the armaments industry, and marriage loans began to flow into the economy. From July to end of September, the number of registered unemployed sank from 4,463,800 to 3,849,200. A miraculous 600,000 Germans removed from the unemployment rolls. However, a significant portion are due to change parameters of who is registered as unemployed, like removing women and those in the labor service or emergency relief work from the count. To be clear, the latter are on subsistence pay in kind by the state, not actual employed. Moreover, up to a third of the unemployment decline came through the pre-Nazi initiatives. Nevertheless, the psychological impact of the downward trend in unemployment was undeniable across the Reich. Part of the real improvement in employment came when in heavy industry the engine of rearmament began to turn again, slowly but surely. The numbers of Friedrich Krupp AG offer a precise monthly snapshot of this recovery during the quarter. In July, their sales figures was 16.6 million Reichsmark. In August, sales jumped to 22.5 million Reichsmark and then stabilized at 19.1 million. To put this in perspective, these figures were significantly higher than the nadir of the previous year, where monthly sales had dropped as low as 11 million. By September 30th, 1933, Krupp's Essen works employed 34,798 people, an increase of over 8,000 workers from the previous October. The other source of improvement was when the government continued to fuel economic activity with massive allocations of credit for public works. Last quarter, the first Reinhard program allocated 1 billion Reichsmark for public works, and on September 21st, the regime doubled down with the second Reinhard plan, allocating an additional 500 million Reichsmark, specifically targeting housing repairs and construction to stimulate the trades before winter. It is in that area that Schacht's economic wizardry comes to play. Normally, the state could not finance any of this without either foreign credits, which due to the economy and restrictions on German spending is currently not an option, or printing new money, which would result in massive inflation, perhaps even hyperinflation, more than eradicating any possible positive effects. Schacht's Alexander chop to split open this double Gordian knot is twofold. One, announcing a take-it-or-leave-it reduction on interest payments on foreign state debt. Two, when he took over as Reichsbank chief, he started to use a credit scheme co-opted out of the machinery of the Weimar Republic to forge an economic miracle. This is run through the Deutsche Gesellschaft für öffentliche Arbeiten AG, ÖFA, which is not a Nazi invention. It was a central financial instrument for the job creation programs initiated by Chancellors Brüning, von Papen, and von Schleicher during the final desperate years of the democracy. When Hitler seized power, his administration did not dismantle this apparatus. They simply commandeered it. In short, the Nazis have now begun to successfully claim political credit for a recovery strategy developed by the very republic they have destroyed. Schacht's predecessor was reluctant to expand this idea for the potential damage it poses to the economy, but when Schacht returned in March this year, he put ÖFA on overdrive, aiming to administer 60% of the government funds released for work creation. That is where the money for the Reinhard program came from. The first charge was already released by the Schleicher government before Hitler, but Schacht now looks to funnel billions of Reichsmarks more through ÖFA to finance labor-intensive public works such as road construction, canal networks, and bridge repairs. The scheme works like this. The German state issues IOUs through ÖFA. With that state-backed guarantee, German banks can loan out money without impacting their balance sheets negatively. This magically produces money that can then be used to pay for public works without printing new money or taking foreign loans. There are some problems here, though. The backing for the IOUs is not covered by any real money, since the German state is already using all their money and more to cover the budget as it is. Also, because of the current restrictions in global economy, they can't refinance the guarantees through foreign loans. If Schacht expands the scheme, as he indicates, covering the IOUs would require an unprecedented economic boom, and by the time these credits would be due, they would far exceed any realistic economic growth projections. This would leave the German economy balancing on a gamble that the true economy experiences a never-before-seen financial miracle, or that Germany grows through some other means, such as conquest. The complex mechanics of these credit instruments creates a bubble that both the outside world and the German people are unaware of, while they celebrate a budding economic miracle built on castles in the air and a deal with the devil that, if it goes any further, might very well tie them to the plans for war to gain Lebensraum that Hitler has long outlined in Mein Kampf. A date with destiny that provides Hitler and the party elite all the more reason for euphoria. Visibly, the Nuremberg rally in September served as a massive release of tension and a celebration of total power. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels captured the ecstasy of the leadership during the festivities. The jubilation in Nuremberg is indescribable. One is almost crushed by it. The Führer speaks about cultural questions, the performance of the Meistersinger, then a diplomatic reception. How happy Magda and I are. However, beneath the surface, sources say that the SA leadership under Ernst Röhm remained dissatisfied with Hitler's declaration that the revolution is over. They continue to agitate for a second revolution to sweep away the conservative elites in the army and business, setting the stage for the conflict to come. Similarly, most of Germans continue to be exalted by a national awakening they feel is long due after the self-inflicted humiliation on the battlefield in 1918. Also, at least for those considered Aryans, the end of street violence continues to be a relief. Martha Dodd, daughter of the newly appointed American ambassador, arrived in Berlin on July 13th and noted the sorcery of the soft summer night and the serenity of the street, which led her to think that the foreign press must have badly maligned the peaceful New Germany. Our housewife in Hamburg, Luise Solmetz, caught in a vice between her nationalist convictions and the shattering news last May that her husband and daughter are suddenly considered Jewish pariah by law, recorded the permeation of Nazi ideology into everyday life. Already before the Nuremberg rally in July, she noted the ubiquity of festivals and flags, observing everywhere and always, again and again, festivals and flags. Despite all, she remains supportive of the national awakening, but secretly wishes that it was the imperial flag, not the swastika, flying along the streets. So far, the Solmetzes are navigating their racial quandary in relative secrecy, while for those already directly targeted by the regime, the normalization is suffocating. Viktor Klemperer, professor in Dresden and of Jewish descent, noted his impression of the pageantry of the Nuremberg rally. Language of the Reich, party rally of loyalty in Nuremberg, loyalty of all things, always have the cheek to claim the opposite. My hopes of a swift about face are fading. The third quarter of 1933 was defined by the successful transition from a revolutionary takeover to a stabilized dictatorship. By declaring the revolution over, Hitler has skillfully neutralized the conservative opposition and calmed the economic markets, paving way for Schacht's economic wizardry to play out in secret, while simultaneously allowing Himmler and Eicke to construct the infrastructure of a permanent police state. Eicke's reorganization of Dachau is the microcosm of this shift. The chaotic sadism of the SA is replaced by the disciplined bureaucratic terror of the SS. This Dachau model allows the regime to institutionalize violence, making it efficient, scalable, and crucially, less visible to the public eye. The regime successfully bifurcates reality, offering bread and circuses with autobahns and Nuremberg rallies to the compliant majority, while perfecting the machinery of elimination for the community aliens. As autumn 1933 approaches, in only 8 months, the Nazi regime has transitioned from a fragile coalition to a consolidated power. The political opposition is legally extinct. The press is a mouthpiece of the state. And in the quiet town of Dachau, Theodor Eicke has forged the weapon, the SS concentration camp system that will enforce the regime's will without mercy. The revolution hasn't stopped. It has merely gone indoors behind the barbed wire. Never forget. I shall return in a week with the next developments in the German Nazi Reich. For some of my broader thoughts on all this and replies to some of your comments under these videos, follow my personal YouTube account here. Also, join the Time Ghost Army so that we can keep on fighting the good fight for history that can help us better understand the world around us and together forge a better future.